This is the Comics Alternative, episode 233. Reviews of Afar, Underwinter #1, and Helena Crash #1. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And this week, Andy and I are going to look at 3 new titles. We're going to begin with Leila del Duca and Kit Seaton's Afar. After that, we're going to look at Underwinter #1 by Ray Fawkes. And then we're going to wrap up with Fabian Rangel Jr. and Warwick Johnson Cadwell's Helena Crash #1. But before we get into that discussion, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off of the cover price, and every single month you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off the cover price, sometimes 50% off cover, but many times you can find discounts that are more impressive than that.
That's right, and this month, as in every month, you can check out their bundles where you can get deeper discounts on multiple comics by the same publisher. You can check out bundles from Marvel, DC, and Valiant, all at 45 to 50% off, so check those out.
That's right. You can always find great discounts of bundles and single issues at Discount Comic Book Service. Their website is dcbservice.com. You gotta go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your comics there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
That's right.
So, Andy, we have some interesting titles to discuss for this week. But before we do that, there is some information that I think we should share with our listeners. Some mail, but before sharing some mail, we need to send a big old thank you to our latest Patreon supporters. And in fact, about an hour before we turned on the mic to record this week's episode, we got an email from Asha and Dave. And they have an account on Patreon together, and they are supporting us for $1 a month. So, Asha and Dave, thank you very much for being our newest Patreon patrons.
Yeah, thanks for helping support us. Every bit counts.
That's right. And, you know, I checked out their Patreon account. You know who else they're supporting in addition to us?
Who else?
Noah Van Sciver and Chester Brown.
Oh, that's good.
We're in good company, my friend.
Yep, we are.
Yeah, Asha and Dave have very good taste. They support Noah Van Sciver, Chester Brown, and the Comics Alternative.
That's good. And those 3 things overlap pretty well, I think, too.
That's right. And if you want to find out more about our Patreon account, then head on over to the Patreon page with that information, which is patreon.com/comicsalternative. And you'll see the various reward levels that we have. And I think you'll be impressed.
Yep. Check it out.
Okay, Andy, now it's time to share some mail we've received over the past week.
Yes.
Mail time. Ooh, the mail's here. That means we get to see our old friend, Mailbox.
So, yeah, I saw this message the other day.
Yeah, the first message we got was of Tuesday of last week, and this is from Ezekiel Garcia. Now, if that name sounds familiar to our listeners, that's because Edward and I reviewed his book, Growing Up in Public, last year, back in the fall, which came out from Fantagraphics. And so he sent us an email. He included me, you, and Edward in that email loop. And he says, "Hi, guys. How are you? My name is Ezequiel Garcia. I'm a cartoonist from Argentina. Last year, I published Growing Up in Public through Fantagraphics, and I heard a beautiful review you did on your Eurocomics podcast. Thanks a lot for that. I'm arriving in Seattle today, where I'll be doing a presentation of the book on Sunday the 25th at 1 p.m. at the Fantagraphics Store and Gallery. I will also be presenting in New York, signing copies at Desert Island on Thursday, March 30th at 7 p.m. If you're based in one of these cities, please come. You're welcome. And if you have a possibility to publicize these events, I'd be very grateful. Thanks a lot, and keep in touch." Ezequiel. So, normally this is an email that Edward and I would wait and share on next month's Eurocomic show. But because of the timeliness of this, Ezequiel being in the U.S. only a brief period, we wanted to share it on this week's regular review episode because, well, the 25th has already passed as the time of this recording. But if you're listening to this on either Wednesday or the following day, the Thursday, which is the 30th, then if you're in the New York area, head on over to Desert Island Comics at 7 p.m. and you can meet Ezequiel Garcia, get a copy of Growing Up in Public, and have it signed.
Yeah, go check out those opportunities. It sounds great. Yeah.
So thank you, Ezequiel, for the very kind email. That was nice to hear from him. But, we have one other message that we should share with our listeners. And this is something that came to us yesterday, Saturday, as we record this, through Twitter. The account with the name Words for Dinner tweeted out to us, and they said, "Listening to at Two Guys with PhDs try to make us spend more money. Greatest thing ever." And then they used the tripod pound, or the pound tripod tag there. And so we want to thank those guys. And I looked them up. I had not heard of these guys before. They're a podcast. They're fellow podcasters just as we are. And other things that they have in common with us, they're also English professors, or they're professors with an English background. And they do a podcast called Words for Dinner, where they look at certain words and phrases and discuss usage issues, history, and things of the sort. And from what I can tell, they've been around for about a year. Their last episode, which I think came out on February 9th, is a discussion of the word irregardless.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah. But they also have looked at other words like surreal, literally, pornography, if that interests you. And also on their very first episode, they defined podcast and the uses of the word podcast. So this is really interesting. Plus I've listened to parts of their podcast. They're like us, and they like to be serious, but also joke around. And the people behind this are Mike and Max.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks for the shout out, and I hope we didn't, damage the pocketbook too much, but yeah, that's what we're here for.
Yes, exactly. So Mike and Max, thank you very much for that shout out. And if our listeners want to check out their podcast Words for Dinner, they can do so by going to Words for Dinner, that's one word, .podbean, PODBEAN.com.
Yeah, check it out.
So, Andy, let's jump into the first title that we're going to be looking at this week. And this is a book that's not out yet. It'll officially be released the first week of April. And it is Afar. It's an original graphic novel by Leila del Duca and Kit Seaton.
Yeah, and this came out from Image, right?
Right. It's coming out from Image. And in fact, this week's going to be a little unusual. We're going to be discussing 2 Image titles. Usually we try to limit the discussion of a publisher to just one title each week. But, we had 2 really interesting releases from Image, and we thought we'd double dip here. But, this is the first Image title. And we have discussed Leila del Duca on the podcast before because I think, didn't we review Shudder?
I wasn't on that episode if we did.
Okay, that's right. I think it may have been another co-host that we looked at the very first issue of Shudder with Joe Keating. But we have had Keating on an interview on the Comics Alternative, and so we mentioned Shudder then as well. So that's where I knew of Del Duca's work previously, and I'm not familiar. I hadn't been familiar with Seaton's work before, but she's done a lot in terms of webcomics.
Okay, yeah, I'm not familiar. I'm not familiar with Del Duca as a writer, and I'm not familiar with Seaton's work before this.
Yes, I guess I was in the same boat. Del Duca is an artist, yes, but this is a writing outing because Seaton does the art in Afar. And some of the webcomics that Seaton has done previously, The Black Bull of Norway, Otto the Dog and Dragon King, and Eve of All Saints.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess our listeners can check out those webcomics as well. And also maybe Sean and I can look at them on a future webcomics episode.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, so how should we set up Afar?
Well, how would you characterize this work? Would you put it in fantasy?
I would, yeah. Fantasy is first and foremost the one word that I would choose to describe Afar.
Mm-hmm. And so the main characters of Afar are 2 siblings, Inatu and his sister Batima, yeah. And they live in this kind of this mystical world that seems on one hand kind of ancient, but also in the future. There is talk of some kind of event called a storm that had taken place in the past that seems to have been something that wiped out a lot of civilization, but left some machinery behind that people are trying to figure out how to use.
Right.
And a lot of that factors into the beginning. But anyway, it also has this kind of fable quality because Inatu and Batima are also left alone by their parents to fend for themselves, so their parents go out and look for work, and they end up facing several challenges. Inatu has a run-in with the people in power in the city they've just moved to, while Batima is discovering that she's got some kind of mystical power that goes on when she sleeps, that she can possibly be inhabiting the bodies of creatures and people on other planets. So these 2 kind of parallel plots are, or intersecting plots are going on through this work. And so I mentioned its fable-like quality being that, it's like so many fables, it's another story of children being left to their own devices while their parents take off and do something else.
Right, exactly. And I think that's a really good setup that you shared. I do think that fantasy is probably one of the best words to describe this. Although, you were talking about the setup to this and this, not really defined event that took place at one point called the Storm. There's something almost or potentially science fiction-y about that, in that for all we know, this could be, if not our world after some kind of major event, but a world very much like ours in some way. Another thing that reminds me somewhat of the sci-fi-ness or potential sci-fi in this story is that you mentioned the powers, those who are in power are after Inotu. The one individual in particular who pursues him is a character by the name of Hanso. And he it reminds me in some ways of DC Cyborg, because he's a human, but there looks to be cybernetic parts of him. He does have something on his face that, again, reminded me of Cyborg, but also one of his arms seems to be cybernetic. So there's something like that going on there. But I think overall this is much more fantasy than anything. If we needed to pinpoint it, which I don't think we have to, not only because of this setup that you've already mentioned, but also there is a fantastical element that's going on here in that Botima, as you pointed out, learns by accident that she has the ability to not only to connect to other individuals on different worlds in an almost ethereal manner, but to do so while she sleeps. And in fact, this only happens while she sleeps. And at first, when she learns about this ability, it bothers her, it disturbs her, she doesn't know what to make of it. But then as the story continues, she seems to almost will herself to sleep in order to get back to certain planets or other worlds where she can inhabit individuals, and one case in particular, pick up where she left off, interacting, so to speak, with these people. Because apparently the way that is explained, what happens is that her consciousness, as she's dreaming, inhabits a being of some sort on another world who also, I think, has a similar kind of ability. And so by inhabiting that being, she experiences what she can, or whatever that being is going through at the time. And that can be quite disorienting. And the assumption, at least I guess, my assumption is that as she's inhabiting the body of the being that she's in, perhaps the consciousness of that other being is either suppressed or maybe even somewhere else.
Yeah. As we learn that that she's not alone in this power. That seems to be the one of the kind of elements of the power, is that if the people she's inhabiting can then go off and inhabit somebody else, or are somehow out there in some way, that they're not suppressed within the psyche or whatever. Though there is, among the developing powers that Botima experiences, one of which is kind of being able to download the memory of the previous person.
Right.
After a while, so it's not such a disruptive experience for her to show up there and not show up in another world and not know anything about what's going on, which kind of gives her away in some cases. Yeah,
and this other world that that Botima particularly wants to get back to in order to finish events or play out events that she started with earlier in the book, she inhabits the body of a character named Lindu. And when she first inhabits that body, Lindu and a good friend of hers, it seems to be someone she feels quite strongly for, romantically, like a lover, Kimdari, have an encounter. And so there's something that goes on with this encounter that Botima feels that she needs to get back into, so to speak, the being of Lindu, to see what happens, to maybe even fix something that she helped to cause. Now, if it sounds like Andy and I are being a little tentative in our description of what's actually going on when Botima is projecting or traveling into other worlds in an ethereal manner, that's because it's never completely explained in Afar what exactly is going on here, which I think I'm okay with to some degree, but this is not the only instance of story world elements in Afar that are hinted at or briefly mentioned without being fully explored. I mean, there were other things here in the story that we're introduced to, and I just assumed we'd learn more of, or certain events or characters would play themselves out a little more, but didn't. And so that has me wondering if, I know this is an original graphic novel, are there going to be more stories based on this world in the future?
Right. And, I think that it's that's an interesting question, because the narrative does come to some closure, at least related to certain conflicts that are going on in the narrative by the end. But as you mentioned, the nature of Batima's powers, along with several other things, are left open at the end, and so I think that how one evaluates this work might depend on what you want out of future volumes, if you expect future volumes at all. I think if you go into there's nothing in the kind of promotional material that I've seen or anything that says this is part one of a series, but it does certainly read like that,
right?
And if that's the case, I think this has the potential to be a really interesting series.
Mm-hmm.
The promotional material does say it's aimed at young adults. I think the idea of a young adult sci-fi fantasy series that features characters of color as the protagonists, I think that is and has a good and compelling story behind it, I think is really valuable. And so I would hope that maybe Image might just be trying to be careful with it or something in their promotion, to not go so far as to say it's a part of a series. But I think it would be great if they did commit to a series with this, because I think it could work really well.
Right. And in fact, I think it would work best as a series. And I think this would even work very well as a single issue series, because there's a lot that could be played out here. Now, a couple things that you've mentioned previously I want to get back to. One, the young adult element here. And I think that's really important. As you pointed out in the setup of Afar, is that we have these two characters, Botima and her younger brother, Inotu, who are abandoned by the parents. Now, we see the parents at the very beginning, and it's not as if the parents abandoned them without any thought whatsoever. The way that the parents frame this is they do it out of necessity, because they need work. The father seems to be, I guess he's an engineer, but he's a little inept at times, or at least he doesn't have the best social skills, in that he seems to get in trouble wherever they go, in terms of not doing the work he promised, or he says that he has the ability to do, and so they have to go from one town to another. And then the mother is someone who does these beautiful crafts, these pots that we see, but she seems to, I don't know, she seems very passive and withdrawn. Either that, I think that may tell us something about the marriage and a little bit more about the father and his relationship with the family. But also the mother, at least I got this impression at the very beginning of the book, seems to be very into her art, almost at the exclusion of the kids. And so even when the parents are there, it's as if the children are by themselves.
Right. I like what you say about the parents, about, in fact, both the mother and father, because one of the things I liked about this work is the way those parents are handled. That, one of the initial events that takes place is that we find out that the father is supposed to be responsible for some kind of water purification system in the town. That is one of those machines that they inherited from whatever the pre-storm culture was. And he has claimed to be able to fix it and run it, and it's not working. And so everybody's drinking seawater. And so he immediately gets blamed for it. And my initial reaction to that was, or my initial expectation with that plot line was, kind of what Inotu's response is too, that the people of the town are wrong. It's not the dad's fault. He knows what he's doing. I don't think this is much of a spoiler to say he doesn't know what he's doing. and the same with something similar with the mother. The mother goes out and collects seashells to make these pots that she thinks are going to be these beautiful works of art that she can sell, but they don't seem to be all that great, and so part of the initial development of the teenage or early teen characters in O2 and Batima is that they are learning that their parents are not perfect,
right?
Which is, of course, one of those very important rites of passage that we all have to go through. that our parents make mistakes. Sometimes they don't tell us the truth, and that's the first step towards them learning too that they're going to have to fend for themselves.
Right.
And in fact, in face of parents who do not make very good decisions altogether.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. The other thing that I wanted to mention goes back to the characters, the main characters, in O2 and Batima, in that, especially in the first half of this book, I had a hard time figuring out who the protagonist was, or maybe another way of putting it is through which character should we be seeing the events, or should we be perceiving the major direction of this story? Is it Batima or is it Inotu? It begins with Batima and this mythical figure of Agama Wanwitu, and which feeds into some of this culture's myths. And the character of Agama Wanwitu is very important in this book. And so at first I thought, okay, Batima definitely is going to be the protagonist here, the one through, we get all the information. We're supposed to identify with her and all of that. Her face is on the cover of the book. This whole issue of projecting to another world, it's her. However, and this is especially apparent in the first half of the book, there's a lot of attention paid to Inotu, and not just him as a character, but there are large chunks of this narrative where we have Itonu basically functions as a de facto narrator because he's writing in a journal, especially as they travel. And again, this takes place primarily in the first half of this book. And Inotu is writing to someone, I guess it's a teacher or a friend of his, named Abina, that he knew in the world where they start at, which is Omo. But they move from Omo to go to another town because of, the parent situation. And so Inotu is writing to this friend of his about what's going on. So it seems as if in those sections that Inotu is going to be the main character. And so I got the feel in Afar that there was kind of a back and forth, almost indecision as to who to follow. And I think that if this were a series, a monthly series, or just something that was ongoing, then the question of, whom should we sympathize with or who is the primary focalizer wouldn't be as much of an issue, because we would just assume that as the series goes on, then the narrative focus would maybe drift from one character to the other, maybe to a third. It's something that we would come to expect, but as a self-contained graphic novel, it became a little confusing to me whom I was supposed to invest my interest in. I mean, obviously both of these characters, right, brother and sister, but which one are we supposed to see through or identify with more? I don't know. That was a quandary I had in the first half of the book, especially.
I don't necessarily have that problem because I don't see a necessity of having to focus on a single character. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you would, would you say that about, a novel that has, would you say that about Mrs. Dalloway? That you can't, that's hard to figure out who to focus on there.
Yeah. And there's some narratives that question is baked into into the story, right? And that's fine. It's just the way that some of these characters are presented, especially with Inotu's narration, his journaling. I think that's what threw me more than anything, because it seemed to me that this kind of overt form of narration means that he's someone through whom we see the primary action. And so it would be interesting to see the dilemma of his sister and what she's attempting to go through the brother's writing. However, that can't be the case because Itonu really doesn't know what's going on when his sister dreams. And so it's this kind of disjunctiveness in terms of narration. And also, I think not just who tells the story, but also focalization is a part of that as well. That I thought maybe, I don't know if it could be cleaned up a little more. For whatever reasons, I was just a little confused at first.
Yeah, and I personally, I don't see that as an issue.
Mm-hmm. And again, I wouldn't have seen it as much of an issue if this were something that was an ongoing story, something like that, because this kind of back and forth drifting from characters' perspectives, I think, would have more of a natural feel to it.
I find that an interesting qualification, that making it an ongoing makes it easy to handle the drifting back and forth. I mean, I think I sort of see something where if we think about something like Batman Year One, for example, where you do have two narrators in Bruce Wayne and Jim Gordon, they're each given kind of diaries, like handwritten diaries, as part of the narration.
Right.
And so maybe if Batima had her own writing that she was doing to shift so that we would, because Inotu's writing is very distinct, since he is not quite as well educated as he probably should be. His studies have been sort of lacking. And so his grammar's really bad. So we'd have that narrative voice, and maybe having Batima doing a journal of some kind where she's keeping track of her dreams and so on could separate those two or put them on a more parallel level. Yeah,
and that's a good point. I think that would be one way to kind of even up the narration playing field, so to speak. Another way of doing that is, even if Batima doesn't keep her own journal like her brother does, then at least having her as narrator, right? So the narration may not be in the form of a diary or a journal,
right,
but it would be her voiceover, right? Her describing to the reader what's going on. I think that would be parallel to what we find with Inotu in his journal. And so that's I think getting to the kind of unevenness that I'm trying to describe.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if they each kind of had an equal level or something of caption boxes, whether those caption boxes are meant to represent writing or just an interior monologue.
Something like that, yeah. As long as within the story there was some kind of indication that we're seeing things from one character, then from the other, that was a little more equal or parallel, I think that I wouldn't have been as confused at times. Not confused, maybe that's not the right word, but I think it would have made a much more even story.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I tell you, one thing I absolutely love about Afar is Seaton's art.
Yes. I think it's a really effective art style, especially thinking of this as a possible work for young adults. It's a really clean style, but it's got an accessibility to it. It's fairly conventional, but with some interesting touches on it. Like, for example, the way memory is depicted in the scenes where Batima's downloading someone's memories that she's in, or what some of the fantasy elements look like. But the storytelling is really solid, and the characters are really well done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's an art style, as you mentioned, that is perfect for this being a young adult book, but at the same time, it's an art that definitely doesn't limit itself to a young adult audience.
Sure.
In other words, an adult could pick this up and not think that the art is a little too young for them.
No, I don't even think someone, could, I don't think even the audience in general would be necessarily limited to young adults, but I think it's a particularly effective as a young adult book because of the two protagonists we have being in that kind of age, in an age where the readers would be able to associate with them if they were teens.
Right. And the reason I mentioned something about young adult, this being a young adult book, is because that's how Image is selling this.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But yeah, the art is really good, and it really excels when we get to those moments in the story where Batima is in her consciousness is in another world,
right?
Because then the colors become very vibrant, very bright more times than not. Because back in their own world, the colors are much more muted. So you look at grays, blues, browns, things of that sort. But once she dreams and goes into other worlds, other beings, then that's when things get really wild with the colors and characters.
Yeah, and it's really inventive too in the way that she draws these other characters on other planets.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I would feel that with as much that is left hanging at the end of this book, I would really, really hope that it is going to be a series of young adult graphic novels, and I hope that Image, and going this route, which they don't tend to go very often, of doing original graphic novels like this, that they would find a property worth investing in to keep going over the course of more than just this one volume.
Right. So, Andy, let's move on to the second title that we're going to be looking at this week, and that is Underwinter #1. This is written and drawn by Ray Fawkes, and it's also another Image comic. Issue #1 came out last week, March 22nd.
That's right. And so this is a new ongoing series, I guess, from Ray Fawkes. Previously, for Image, he had written and drawn the series Intersect, which I think went 6 issues. Mm-hmm. And Intersect was a series we did talk about that first issue on the podcast when that came out ages ago, and it was an abstract series, to say the least. And it was one that I really felt, and I think I said this even at the time, that it required me to sit down and read multiple, issues together all at once to kind of get into the rhythm and the flow of it, to figure out what the information was, because it didn't lend itself to easy reading. And I think that, I admire challenges like that, reading challenges like that. I feel like so far, at least with this first issue of Underwinter, that it is not as challenging as Intersect was, but that remains to be seen.
Right. Now, the first issue of Underwinter is much more straightforward than the first issue of Intersect. And my experience with Intersect is very similar to yours, that I remember sitting down to first read this after issue #2 came out. And I read the first issue, didn't really get a feel that I understood what happened. So then I read that first issue again. Then I read the second issue, seemed even more confused. So I was like, okay, maybe if I read the second issue again, I'll get a sense of things. And so by the time that I had read multiple times in one sitting, both issues 1 and 2 of Intersect, I still was a little unclear, but I was like you, intrigued and felt, okay, but something like this, I'm willing to invest the time and the confusion in trying to figure out what's going on. Now, whereas the art in Underwinter reminds me quite a bit of the kind of art we see or saw in Intersect, the story is quite different. But in terms of the art, it does have this kind of soft watercolor feel to it, as if something is almost dreamlike in a way.
Right. And I think that's an interesting aspect of Fawkes's approach to these comics that he does. If we can, I don't know, try to summarize the plot of Underwinter #1, we're dealing with a musical quartet for the most part. There's other diversions beyond this, but the core of the book involves this musical quartet that's hired to do some really kind of strange performance at a mansion where they're required to be blindfolded while they perform music that they've had to memorize, stuff that they would have memorized probably already because of the level of talent that they have. And so, there's even an allusion to Eyes Wide Shut early in the book to give, for Fawkes to kind of give his, his works cited for this because, that in Eyes Wide Shut, that's sort of what happens there. There's only a piano player, but he's blindfolded and required to play from memory. So we're already kind of in that world of a kind of decadent, wealthy elite who are having these parties that something definitely strange is going on. Now, we only get a hint of what's going on at this party at the very end, but and then we get little kind of sidetracks with other things that are going to be going on in the series. And so all we know is that whatever it is really, really weird. But I think it's a good setup for that kind of mystery. Right.
And not only is the quartet blindfolded, but they have to wear certain things, and there's certain things that they can't wear. So, for instance, one of the requirements is there can be no tattoos. Now, as we learn, one of the members of the quartet, I think this is Stephanie, has the acerbic one. Apparently she has a tattoo, but they said that they were going to cover that with makeup, so it wouldn't be apparent. So there's a little strangeness, it's uncertain requirements for this, but this is a quartet that it really needs the work, and it pays extremely well, so they're willing to do this. Yeah. Now, you're right. They're the core of this first issue, but we are introduced to, I don't know if you'd say a couple of other characters or a couple of other situations. The issue begins with someone speaking, and they're telling us about nightmares that they continue to have. So on the first page it says, I keep having these nightmares, and I think I know why. Candles guttering in the deep, yawning dark, throwing a light across the strings or the scrowl across the lacquered body. And of course you have the violin. Now, I was trying to figure out by the time I got to the end of this first issue, because then we have I'm assuming it's a similar voice who is telling us about something like a dream that they're experiencing. Which of the four members of this quartet is speaking here? I had thought at first that it was Eleanor Parker, because she is the first character that we see and we know as one of the members of the quartet. When we first see her, she is in a cafe waiting for the rest of the quartet. But I don't know if for certain that's who this narrator is who's telling us about the nightmares.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's it is whoever at the end is able to get a glimpse of what's going on at this party.
Right. Yeah.
And I'm not sure who that is at this point.
Yeah. And that's uncertain. And I like that. I like that bit of ambiguity baked into this first issue. But we're also introduced after that opening scene, which is like a prelude. Then we have the title page, and I'm assuming that this is the house of the rich individual that they're playing at, I guess. Something's going on. Someone's screaming. A woman is being escorted or dragged, maybe, out of the house. And someone is instructing this. Some guy is saying, take her out. But again, there's just enough ambiguity here where we can maybe rightfully assume that this scene has something to do with what we learn later in the issue, but we're not entirely certain of the specifics.
Right.
Yeah, who these people are, and who is this woman, why is she screaming, and who's the guy who's saying that she needs to be taken out, and how nefarious is this? Right.
Yeah, I'm. When I was reading this with that scene in particular, and the opening scene with the dream, it did remind me of things that Fawkes deals with in a lot of his creator-owned stuff. He seems to be very interested in issues of the body and especially of pain. That was something that came up in Intersect, but also if we think about like Junction True, not just pain, but the kind of addiction to pain, and addiction, and maybe in general too. So I think I get the feeling we're going to see Fawkes dealing with some of those issues once again in this series as well, and I think that that's very interesting, and it makes me look forward to reading this series some more. I do feel like I'm on firmer ground with this first issue than I was with the first issue of Intersect, and maybe that's maybe that's something Fawkes has been working on, or it's just what the nature of the story is lends itself to that. I'm not sure.
Right. Another thing that I'm impressed by in this first issue is the way that Fawkes is able to give us, over a relatively short span. I mean, this is a regular issue size first issue, right? So this is not a longer first issue. We have, I guess, about 20 pages of story, if that. So there's really not much of a comic compared to, let's say, some number ones. However, what he does in this first issue is quite phenomenal. The four members of the quartet, Eleanor, Kendall, Stephanie, and Corbin, I feel that by the time I got to the end of this first issue, I had a pretty good sense of who these people are. And I think that's impressive, given that this is kind of a regular-sized first issue, because we've mentioned that there are other things going on here in addition to the quartet members. So I think that I could vaguely describe who these characters are. So, for instance, Kendall seems to be the leader of the quartet, and he's someone who is very sensual, and maybe even ego-centered to a point. Stephanie is the acerbic one, no nonsense. Corbin may have some kind of drinking problem or some kind of addiction. Eleanor, I don't know, strikes me as somewhat of a little more Puritan-like or straight-laced than the others. Now, I may be completely off here, but my main point is that Fawkes gives enough information of each of these four characters over a relatively short span of panels to where I feel I know them well enough, and I'm not confused. I'm prepared to go on to issue number 2. Bottom line for me, this first issue is one of the best done first issues that I've seen in a long time.
Yeah, I mean, I'm that final page kind of throws us into a world that I have no idea what's going on with that final page in a good way.
Right.
I want to know more with that. I think it's interesting what you say about the characters being realized in this first issue, because one of the things I was thinking about in reading this, and sort of in relationship to reading Afar, was the art in these are two completely different books, but reading them at about the same time, they got kind of juxtaposed in my mind. That the art in Afar is very accessible, and I am invested in the characters in that story a lot because of the art. Mm-hmm. I've often found Ray Fawkes' art really beautiful, but also it kind of distances me from characters because we don't get a lot of facial expressions. We don't get
not detailed.
Yeah, right. And I'm so busy. It's often that I'm just kind of so busy marveling at the art, at the beauty of the art, that that almost puts us, another step in place before thinking about the art as sequential narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And as I was reading this, I was thinking too that, I don't think that McLeod ever deals with this sort of artwork when he talks about, the picture plane and so on. Mm-hmm. Talks about, the idea that it's not hyper realistic, but beautifully watercolored sequential art. Does that present a barrier to really kind of getting emotionally invested in a story? I'm not sure. Fawkes' influences seem to be, primarily like David Mack and Bill Sienkiewicz, both of whom are artists I really like and admire. So I don't know if I've ever had an issue with them, but I'm curious to see how this series goes along. If I go beyond like an understanding of each of these individual characters and maybe feel more of an investment with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting what you said about Fawkes' characters, the way that he illustrates them in his works, and the distancing that you feel as a result. I definitely see where you're going there. My sense of things in Underwinter #1 is that I feel a little closer to these characters, or maybe a better way of putting it is that I know them at least a little bit more than, let's say, characters in other stories I read. Not so much because of the art, but the interaction, right? So what one says to another about a third member tells me something about not only the individuals in this quartet, but also their relationship, the dynamic that's going on there. So what Stephanie says about Kendall, or what Corbin comments on in terms of Stephanie and then Eleanor, I feel that I have a tentative grasp of who these people are and how they work together.
Right.
But you're definitely on point when you mention the lack of detail in his characters tend to have brings this sense of disconnect, right? That we may not even know who these people are, which is, I think, in this book quite significant, because with certain faces, we can't even see them because they're blindfolded.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Once we get to the end, but even one of the characters, I think I first, in fact, got struck home with this because of the one character, one of the male characters, the one with glasses.
Corbin,
yeah, that he, we don't even see, even when we just see the other character's eyes as being like slants or whatever, we can't even see his eyes through the opaque glasses.
Right, yeah, and I think I'm looking at the page right now that you may be referring to. Is it that the glasses are opaque, or is his eyesight so bad that even with glasses, he's squinting his eyes to try to see? It's hard to discern.
Right.
Yeah. So, yeah, I really like this first issue of Underwinter. And have they announced if this is going to be a miniseries or what?
I'm not sure. It doesn't say anything in the book itself, so it would be, I think.
And I can't remember if they announced that Intersect was going to be a 6-issue series, or if this is something that after the first 2 or 3 issues, they just decided maybe we can only do 6 issues.
No, I'm pretty sure that that in talking to Ray, because he had come to the comic show I do in Sumter the first year we had it, and Intersect had been coming out for a little bit. He had said that the original intention was that it would be a ongoing series, but that they were going to end it after 6 issues.
Okay.
Kind of, I think what happens with a lot of stuff, something similar to what happened with Rich Tommaso's stuff as well recently. But what I wonder about Underwinter is if it's going to be a kind of anthology, that it may not necessarily follow the same characters every
story arc.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so the Image website describes it as a new monthly horror series.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah, and it could be something like with every arc you get a different kind of story that is horror, but just a collection of different stories. I can see that, because there's only so long that you can play out this particular story that we're starting with in issue 1.
Sure.
Yeah.
And that might help mitigate the idea that there may only be enough sales for 6 issues at a time, then have multiple volumes of Underwinter or something with different titles.
Right.
Because this one's Symphony Part 1, right? So there we go.
Well, let's move on to the final title that we're going to be looking at this week, and this is Helena Crash #1, published through IDW, and this is written by Fabian Rangel Jr. with art by Warwick Johnson Cadwell.
Mm-hmm.
And were you familiar with the work of either Rangel or Cadwell before this?
I'd seen Fabian Rangel's name pop up on stuff. I don't think I had read, like, for example, what is it? The Doc Unknown. Is that the thing he's most known for?
I don't know. I know he's done Fubar, right?
Okay.
So maybe that's where I have seen his name before. I've seen the name. I don't know if I'm familiar with his work. Although the art here, Cadwell's art, I may not have seen it before, but I tell you, it really does look familiar.
So I hadn't been familiar with Cadwell's work either, but at first it really did remind me of something like what Chris Sheridan did on Motorcycle Samurai, and maybe the fact too that both of them are, futuristic vehicle-oriented comics also drew them together in my mind for me.
Yeah, that makes sense now. And maybe that's why I had that feeling of familiarity looking at issue #1 of Helena Crash. You're right. It does have that feel that Motorcycle Samurai had. So, I mean, it's not the same thing as Sheridan's art, but it just reminds me of that. I just couldn't remember why it reminded me. And now you explained it. So thank you.
Yeah. So Helena Crash is a fun first issue. And we're in this future world where basically where coffee is illegal. And so Helena is kind of a coffee smuggler. She's a person who can get coffee to people who will pay her well for it. And she drives an old style race car. and shoots guns.
Right. Yeah. When you said that this was a fun title, I think that, I said that earlier in our discussion of Afar, fantasy is one word that leaps out to me about that book. Fun is the word that's predominant with Helena Crash #1. This is a great story, great first issue because it's so much fun. Now, you mentioned coffee being illegal. From what we see toward the beginning of this issue in the setup, it's illegal because there were some kind of in this world, it seems to be a futuristic world. The environment has gone downhill to the point that it is very difficult to produce certain crops, and whatever it takes to grow coffee, given the environmental conditions, it's now illegal to do so, to grow it, to sell it, to, I guess, produce it, brew it. And that's where we get Helena. And I remember looking at the cover of Helena Crash, and I guess it's the main cover because there's several different covers. And we have 2 or 3 variants. But I guess the main cover, you see her in front of her car with a machine gun and a cup of coffee. And I thought that cup of coffee, her standing there with that cup of coffee, was weird in context. So I was like, oh, she must really love coffee. But then I started reading, into this first issue, and it started to make sense, right? That she is a coffee smuggler. And I think it's kind of a weird premise, but it works really well.
Yeah. And I mean, we've seen other stories that take place in the near future that deal with something that is common to our existence being illegal. And chew comes to mind, right? Yeah. And so, but I like the explanation that it isn't because coffee is there's some kind of future nanny state that decides that coffee is too addictive and wants to keep people away from having coffee. It's the combination of the environment and making coffee difficult to grow, and the fact that it is so addictive that it has caused people to go crazy without it, so that the government has to just ban it altogether in order to control it.
Right. And, the part of this first issue where we're getting some of the setup here, we see her on one page. It's a 9-panel grid, and she's making coffee in the morning, and she's opening the coffee, and she says to the coffee, "Morning, gorgeous." And she's scooping it out, putting it in the coffee maker. I love the name of the coffee that she's brewing. It's called Sailor Mouth.
Right. Yep.
Yeah, and that just tells you something about the humor of Helena Crash. I think it's a really interesting series. Now, she is a smuggler, and we learn that she has a job that she's doing for a gangster by the name of Rojo. And so she is getting Rojo coffee through her supplier, which is a boxer who had been her teacher when she was younger, someone whose name is Kid Hemingway. And in fact, his brand of coffee is called TKO coffee. So she gets Rojo's coffee from Kid, and, having an adventure on the way, eventually gets it there. But then Rojo wants to hire her for something else entirely, something that is really not in her line of work, and she resists. And so by the time we get to the end of this first issue, we have a major tension point.
Right. And it's, that plot is a plot that you get in a lot of noir and crime comics,
and heist and things of that sort.
Yeah, exactly. The person who's good at their job and wants to stay in their comfort zone and is asked to do something that is outside of that, and by turning it down, they put themselves in danger. If they accepted it, they would put themselves in danger, so they're not in a good position one way or another.
Right. Yeah.
But taking that I don't know, that familiar plot, and then putting it in this interesting world in which there's, fast cars, there's gangs that are addicted to explosions, and there's illegal coffee. I think makes this is part of what makes this a fun book. Right. And that Rojo is a luchador.
Yeah, there's that. And I'm glad you mentioned that Rojo's a luchador, because we had said that this is a world where the environment's gone wrong, but it's not our world, right? So it's not the world that we all know. It's not that kind of futuristic story, because there's certain characters in this book that could not be from this world because they seem more animal-like. And one example of this is in Rojo's bar toward. Maybe it's before she gets to Rojo's bar, but she goes, no, yeah, this is not Rojo's, but she is going into a bar, and she's talking with the barkeep, and there's some guy there who has a sandwich sitting on the bar, and he yells at her, hey, you're breathing on my sandwich. And then, there's a fight between the two of them. He fires his weapon at her. She dodges. And when she takes out her knife and she hits him back with her fist. And when she hits his head, it inflates like a puffer fish. And if you see him in the panels before, his head does look like a deflated or flattened puffer fish. And I thought that was a fun touch.
Yes, it is. It is great that you punch somebody in their head. Just expands.
Yeah. And it's right after that one of Rojo's guys gives her a card and says, Rojo wants to see you.
Right.
And I don't know if he's a wolf man or what, but he definitely looks like one. So this is, and his companion is purple. This is a world with unusual creatures, only some of which are humanoid.
Right.
So I'd be interested to see how this series plays out, and if this is one that at least ideally is planned for an ongoing without any end in the near future, or if this is going to be limited either intentionally or otherwise.
Right. Yeah. I think this is another new series from IDW in particular that I have high hopes for in the future.
Yes. Well, there you go. 3 very different books that we looked at this week. We started off with Leila del Duca and Kent Seaton's Afar. After that, we looked at Underwinter #1 by Ray Fawkes. And then we wrapped up with Helena Crash #1, written by Fabian Rangel Jr., with art by Warwick Johnson Cadwell.
Yep. Three interesting books to check out.
Yeah, and we know where you can go to get great titles like this, and that is the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. Head on over to dcbservice.com, and there you're going to find a ton of discounts every single month, guaranteed. We use it, and we think you should as well. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what you thought about this week's episode. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
That's right, or you can get a hold of us by email. We are 2 guys at comicsalternative.com, and you can get a hold of us individually. I'm Andy at comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com.
You can also check out our Twitter feed, which is at the number 2 guys with PhDs.
That's right, but you can find us elsewhere on social media, such as on Facebook. Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on iHeartRadio, on Spotify, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, which is comicsalternative.com.
That's right. All the ways to get a hold of us, let us know how we're doing, and find out what we're doing.
That's right. And as you're listening to this, you may have just a couple of more days to tweet out using the tripod hashtag and also our unique hashtag, which is try2guys, and let people know that you listen to a podcast with discerning taste, the Comics Alternative.
Yep.
So until next week, I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy. See ya.